Welcome to European Union Governance and Policy Challenges, an online training from the University of Washington. This training was co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union and was produced by the Center for West European Studies and the EU Center, a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence in the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies.
So I'm just going to talk really briefly about the process of getting into the EU, and then I'm going to talk about the acquis communautaire, the body of EU regulation and law that you sign up for when you come into the EU. We'll talk a little bit about current candidates, and then what it means to get out of the EU, looking at the Brexit process. Okay, so getting into the EU is an ongoing kind of stepwise process, and it generally begins with what's called an association agreement, sometimes abbreviated AA, but usually you just say it, association agreement. And this is the beginning of an alignment between a country and its legal system and its tariffs and other barriers and routes with the EU. So right now, for example, Ukraine has an association agreement, but it's just a very first step that doesn't necessarily automatically mean there will be further steps. If after the association agreement goes well and you've become well aligned with the EU on some basic topics, you then have the opportunity to put together an SAA, a stability and association agreement. And this is a true first step towards membership. It signifies a considerably higher degree of alignment of your rules, regulations, and procedures with the EU. And in almost every case, really is a solid step towards candidacy. And at that point, once you have an SAA, you have the opportunity to submit your actual application for membership. And for example, right now, Bosnia and Herzegovina they have an SAA completed. They've submitted their first application. The Commission has come back to them with 655 questions in a questionnaire. And once that they have filled out and submitted satisfactory answers to all 655 questions, then they can be considered for full candidacy. The Commission has the option to come back and keep asking more questions before actually making someone or making a country a full candidate and beginning the accession process. Once you've actually gotten that far, you then directly open negotiations. And most of the Western Balkan states, Serbia, etc., are in negotiations now with varying degrees of rapidity. So is Turkey, although their negotiations have been stalled and shut down for 3 or 4 years now. They keep on discussing reopening them, often as kind of an attempt to throw Turkey a carrot for better behavior, but that's going nowhere fast. And so typically there are 35 or so chapters of negotiations, and they'll cover fisheries, data, consumer protection, employment law, on and on, kind of a fairly normal list of topics, but it's a little bit different for every country and every accession. So if that matters to you, really look at their particular list of accession chapters. And they'll work through one chapter at a time. And what's really happening there is that the European Commission is certifying that the applying country's laws have been rewritten or in the process of being rewritten to be in compliance with EU law and regulation. And so this is where we come back to this idea of the EU as kind of a regulatory or an overarching regulatory body. EU law is not what you get charged under if you're doing something illegal at the EU level. You get charged in German law or French law that has been brought into compliance with what the EU treaties and regulations specify. And so for longstanding members like Germany and France, it's not too big a deal. They've done all this work over many, many decades. For a new member coming in, the process of completely rewriting your legal system, your laws, your procedures to be in compliance with the acquis communautaire, which is the full body of EU treaty, law, regulation, and judicial decisions to date. So it just, the acquis, the body of existing EU stuff, right? Rewriting your entire legal system so that it is certified as being compliant is an immense process. And when we talk about policy and when we talk about negotiations, we often talk about consistency and uniformity. Consistency means consistent over time, and uniformity means the same among many jurisdictions. And so this is a huge consistency issue to try and bring, for example, the law of Serbia into compliance with the EU treaties and thus make it uniform in terms of effectiveness with the rest of the EU. And so the process has been described as like trying to replace your airplane engine while you're in flight, because you have to do all this without crashing your economy, without confusing everyone, without making it unclear whether the new law or the rewritten law or the old law is what applies on any given day, right? I mean, this could be looked at as an employment program for lawyers. It's an immensely complicated process, even for a relatively small country. And when you start talking about larger countries with larger economies, it becomes a truly challenging process that usually takes several years. So, assuming that all this goes through, eventually the European Council has the opportunity to give a unanimous vote, or a hopefully unanimous vote, on your candidacy and let you begin the process of accession. Once you're an EU member, you're then in a very interesting and powerful position. You now have a veto vote on any new member coming in. Almost nothing can go forward without your vote. And you also have massive obligations. You've bought into the four freedoms, right? You've bought into the free movement of people, goods, services, and money. Your citizens can now go and live anywhere in the EU they want. Sometimes countries implement a transition period for a new member and say, for example, for Poland, that it'll be 4 years after accession before a country will just freely accept members from a new country. They don't want a surge of people coming in just right upon the day they join the EU. But overall, part of signing up for the acquis is that you're signing up for the full meal deal. You're signing up for everything that the EU does. If you join now, you're agreeing to join the euro at some point. The language actually is very vague on that. It just says when you're ready. But all members that have joined after the euro began in 2000 are 100% technically, legally committed to become members of the Eurozone eventually. And so you start contributing between 2% of your GDP towards the EU budget. It breaks out a little bit differently. A graphic worth looking at is net donor nations and net recipients. Have any of you ever looked at a list of net donor states for the US and net recipient states for US taxes? Probably many of you have seen that. It's always a little worrisome. There's, about 11 US states that are net givers and the rest are net recipients. And that's true in the EU also. And, we can sit here and we can list probably off the top of our heads the list of states that are net donors. Germany. Really, Germany is the big net donor. Huge budget. And so an interesting aspect of these negotiations is often when we're talking about what is the EU going to do, the conversation we're really having is what is Germany willing to pay for? Which is, always ends up being a little bit of an awkward discussion. So anyway, Germany, France is a modest net donor because they are one of the biggest recipients of agricultural aid under the Common Agricultural Policy. So they are a net donor, but just barely. Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, right? The rich and often described as old Europe countries are the net donors, and everyone else is a net recipient. Um, and so the divide among donors and recipients in terms of their overall satisfaction with the EU tends to be fairly stark. This process of kind of working out your relationship with the EU can be really challenging, right? All of a sudden, for a new member, there's this whole layer above everything you're used to. There's a layer above your government, there's a layer above your courts. There are outside courts, the European Court of Justice in particular, that can overrule your national courts. And that leads to some pretty ugly disputes. There's actually a fairly famous dispute between Austria and the EU that came after the 2004 accession of the former Eastern Bloc states. All of a sudden, there was tremendous call for goods to be coming from the new Eastern states across into Central Europe. And the obvious pathway for that is through Austria. And they had a couple of roads, but they weren't big roads, highways, that ran through nearly pristine alpine alleys and got a few trucks a day beforehand. Or alpine valleys, not alleys, sorry. And all of a sudden, there are all of these diesel trucks coming through from Hungary and Romania, driving through Austria and dumping loads of heavy and gross pollution into these, beautiful alpine habitats. And Austria first asked if they could ban the trucks from coming through, and the EU said, no, they're EU legal road trucks. You have to let them in. And then they said, well, can we enact a higher level of environmental standard for trucks coming through so they don't destroy these pristine environments? And the EU said, no, you can't have anything unique or that's, above what the standards for EU as a whole are, anything that would shut out an EU member from coming in. And Austria ended up taking this, to the maximum level, and they got a ruling back from the ECJ that essentially told them to go pound sand. They were stuck with it. They couldn't do anything, and they had to let these trucks through. So Austria is in the process of building a railway for trucks through this area so that they will actually pick up the trucks on one side of the valley, drive them through on the train or roll them through on the train, and then release them on the Austrian border out to the rest of the EU as their preferred policy solution to this. But it's a really tough political sell when your EU membership means that the ECJ tells you can't protect your environment, right? These end up being really challenging situations. And there's no kind of obvious pathway to fixing it. At that point, you've signed up for everything, you're a little bit stuck with it. So that leads us to the process of getting out. And it's kind of an ongoing threat. Most EU members, particularly those that are net donors, have at least at some point had an internal conversation about, is this whole EU thing really worth it? Are we getting what we pay for? Why are we paying more than other countries? And why are we buying new port facilities for people in Portugal or in Greece or in Romania, right? And overall, the conversation has been that in the end, they get back much, much more than they put in, and it's worth staying in. But it's, again, particularly for the net donor countries, it's often a significant discussion. Greece came very, very close to getting thrown out of the EU, although there's no technical mechanism for that as part of their credit default and really endangering the euro system. The EU as a whole came very, very close to declaring that they either had to leave or simply refusing to back their currency, forcing them out of the Eurozone, which in essence would force a dropout from the EU as a whole. Greece didn't want to leave. And we're not really talking about the financial crisis in detail, but one of the reasons there was a problem is as Eurozone members and users of the euro, outside entities were offering Greece credit loans at a rate very similar to the rate that Germany would have gotten. And Germany, of course, has perfect credit. They're your friend who, has nothing but great credit cards and huge bank accounts all the time, right? And because it was pretty clear that Germany could not afford, and to a lesser extent France and other countries, could not afford to let the euro crash completely, the assumption was exactly what happened, that the rest of the Eurozone would have to come in, support the currency, support Greece, and bail them out, no matter how badly the loans went. So Greece is given the opportunity to have all of these really low credit rate, high limit loans. They say that's great. Turns out they can't pay them because the tax system is a mess. And there we kind of run into this question of what happens when you unify the currency but leave the taxation and monetary systems of the members of the currency completely individualized and unaligned, right? You end up with a really rough situation where the more stable and wealthy members end up essentially having to support the less stable, or if you prefer the German point of view, financially or fiscally responsible members. Anyway, all of this kind of leads up to the Brexit process, and we don't need to go super deeply into it, but the essence is that the UK was a little bit of a hesitant EU member from the get-go. They were late to join, as you'll remember. They didn't join until the 1970s, and weren't so sure about it, had to go through a couple of votes about joining. And they've always felt pretty clearly that somehow they were meaningfully different than their continental European brethren, and weren't really necessarily signed up for all of this continental squabbling. They never signed up for the Schengen zone, visaless and checkpoint-free travel. So you always had to check in to the EU and go through customs, even if you were coming from the rest of the EU. They've always felt very strongly about keeping diseases like rabies, which is, by the way, just rampant on the European continent. If you go into parks in a lot of Europe, you'll see traps for rabid animals that have signs that you should stay away from them. So it's not an invalid concern. It's a real thing that they want to keep rabies out of the British Isles. But that means animal checks and just all kinds of higher level checks at the UK borders than have been prevalent inside the rest of the EU for many years now. And in essence, one of the things that ended up happening in British newspapers over the last 20 years is writers ended up, in some ways, inventing the idea of clickbait by explaining all these ridiculous things that the EU was doing and how badly it disadvantaged the UK, and how the UK wasn't getting its money's worth, and the EU was trying to regulate ridiculous things like the size of a French fry. And in fact, there is a regulation for the Euro chip, which is neither long and skinny like a French pomme frite, nor short and thick like a British chip. It's, a good European compromise, kind of about halfway between. And by the time the EU gets around to designating a European standard French fry, there's maybe some opportunity to make fun of it a little bit, right? Anyway, the long and the short of it is that members of the UK's Conservative Party, backbenchers as they call them, relatively unimportant members of Parliament, had been pushing the idea of leaving the EU essentially as a way to get more attention within their party. They'd been advocating it in the media, they'd been advocating it with their members, and really pushing hard enough to cause the party leadership to decide something needed to be done about it. And the prime minister at the time agreed to allow a national vote, perhaps with the idea of the vote on Scottish secession, that Scotland should split off and become an independent country a few years before. They'd allowed the vote. Scotland had voted to stay, and then the issue is now gone. And we don't obviously know what John Major, the Prime Minister at the time, had in mind, but he hasn't written his book yet. But the thesis seems to be that he had that kind of solution in mind. Offer a referendum, offer an opportunity for the vote, shut up the backbenchers, get them off his and the party's back for the foreseeable future, and continue onward. We all know the rest of that history. The vote took place. It was very aggressively contested and ended up with a 52% leave vote. There remain considerable questions about whether that really represents what people wanted. An ongoing issue with any referendum is that it often becomes a referendum not on the topic in hand, but on people's satisfaction with the government at the time. It's one of the reasons you want to be really careful about just putting a vote to the people. It's not always about what it claims to be about. And the sense was that there was considerable voting being done just based on dissatisfaction or wanting a better deal from the EU rather than really wanting to leave. But with the 52% victory, the Conservative Party became locked in. The Prime Minister resigned the next day, saying that he was not the person to carry this forward, and ran the Conservative Party into a very, very difficult corner. Having brought up this vote, could they now step away from it? Could they, right? Politically, what alternatives did they have? The new Prime Minister called an election soon after, which was intended to sort of create some opportunities to maybe fix or step away from the vote. That was a disaster. They lost almost all their power and needed to go into a coalition government rather than a majority government. This is Theresa May, who had been the former Home Minister. Anyway, as we roll through this process, we can see some real challenges. Is departure really what the people wanted? But having put up a referendum, can you then just keep doing referenda until you get the results? Is that democratic? What's really the right thing? And it's pretty obvious that departing from the EU is going to be incredibly painful for the UK. Incredibly painful. The UK is about 40% self-sufficient in food, less than that in critical medicines. Most of their critical medicines are made in the EU. For the Airbus consortium, there are parts that are worked on both sides of the channel several times. So a single part will get created in the UK, go across the channel to get worked on in France, be put into a piece of equipment in Germany that then goes back to the UK to get assembled into an airplane engine that then goes back to get assembled onto the actual airplane in France, right? The whole idea of shutting down or stopping that kind of ongoing commercial work is a mess. A significant proportion of the UK national health system, doctors and nurses, are from the EU and living in the UK because of better wages available in the national health system. And those people are starting to go home, right? It's the implications of this are almost unthinkable. The piece that's important today is the gap between a Brexit with a deal and a no deal or crash out Brexit. And we have a hard deadline coming up on December 31st of this year, where the transition period, so the UK formally left the EU in March of 2020. And so Brexit has technically occurred, but really it's just that the UK has left the institutions. Everything else remains in place. The customs union remains in place. The single market remains in place. ECJ decisions continue to affect the UK. And so they've left all of the bodies. They've left Parliament, they've left the Commission, they've left the Council, but yet are still completely subject to all the rules and regulations, which in some ways is kind of the worst of all possible worlds, right? To still be 100% subject to the regulations that they're trying to get free from without having any say in the bodies that decide or manage them. So this transition period is coming to an end quickly, and the possibilities are essentially two. One is that the EU and the UK reach a detailed trade agreement that will govern their relationship going forward and allow some kind of structure to trade and immigration and services and all these other things between the UK and the rest of the EU. Or they fail to come to an agreement and either extend this transition period another year, however long it takes to come up with an agreement, or decide that there is going to be no agreement and just allow the UK a no deal exit, or a crash out if you prefer, in which simply one day at the end of the transition period, the UK has no association with the EU, no trade treaty, no agreement whatsoever, and then takes on a position not of a single market member or even a trade agreement like the US has or Norway has as a member of the European Free Trade Area, but a completely disassociated agreement like a small Caribbean or African country might have with the EU, no special treatment of any sort, which requires vastly more customs checks for goods, things that simply get on a truck in the UK today. Clams, for example, can be dug on the UK coast in the morning and be served in a Paris restaurant that evening. That's a very common thing today. If instead those clams need to be inspected, checked, tested, there's no agreement whatsoever about the quality of the clams or pre-inspection or an EU inspector going to the clam farm and checking them beforehand, right? The extent to which no deal means no deal. No deal. No deal on anything is a little hard to get your head around, right? It means that the UK, for example, is completely out of the EU information sharing agreements for passports and entry. So they don't have, if you have no deal, one of the things you don't have a deal on is how people with your passport are treated when they come up to an EU border station. Now, your passport is swiped on the UK side, and while you're traveling, they run a background check on you and decide if there's any reason why you shouldn't be admitted to the rest of the Schengen zone. And if there's a problem, they grab you on the train on the other side or off your flight and deal with it then. But what if there's no information sharing? What if there's no background check, right? It's the scope of this and what it really means to have a crash out is essentially unthinkable. So that's where we are today. I'd sent you that article. They're in the midst of trying to negotiate this. Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, keeps on pushing back and saying, we're not the only ones who need to be flexible here. But, we've all broken up with people before, right? When you break up with someone and say, I'm sure I can do better than this relationship, I'm out of here. How flexible are they likely to be about, letting you see your dog? Or, sharing out their old vinyl record collection with you afterwards, right? The person who's gotten dumped tends to be pretty inflexible. And it's hard to describe the EU as being, completely unwilling to work with the UK at this point. But it's also fair to say they're pretty frustrated And if it were not for the tremendous impact on the Irish border, I think they'd probably just say good riddance, don't let the door hit you on the way out. What's going on there, the Irish border situation, is that Ireland is a single island as part of the UK, the greater British archipelago. The southern three quarters of the island or so is governed by the Republic of Ireland, a completely independent country. Northern Ireland is part of the UK, and the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland has been a really contentious issue, and one of the areas of significant part of the Irish Troubles and the Northern Irish Insurrection has been whether Northern Ireland should belong to the island of Ireland on which it sits, or be in union, part of the United Kingdom as a whole. And with both the UK and Ireland as EU members, that problem was essentially solved. That border could be open, that border could be free, you could walk back and forth across from Northern Ireland to Ireland, and it wasn't a big deal. Without the UK being part of the EU, all of a sudden that's a hard border again. And so the question of whether the border between the EU and the UK should be at the Northern Irish border or the water channel between the Irish Sea, which essentially means that Northern Ireland would be operating under EU rules while the rest of the UK was operating under UK law. Obviously, the unionist parties and the unionist politicians in Northern Ireland are just freaking out about that possibility, because it's essentially, from their point of view, that Northern Ireland is being abandoned to this EU Brexit process. All of which wouldn't be so bad. Northern Ireland is kind of used to getting screwed over by the UK, except that until a few months ago, the Conservative Party's parliamentary majority was dependent on, yeah, you guessed it, the Northern Ireland Unionist Party were their coalition partners that gave them a governing majority. So what a mess, right? There's just kind of every possible level of this. Anyway, the things I'd like you to take away from this are that the membership process is challenging, multi-layered, and difficult. Taking on the privileges and responsibilities of an EU member is a huge deal. The Brexit process is in a very sort of strange and delicate place now, and I'm not sure what we're going to see at the end of this year. I find it hard to imagine that they're going to come to a deal that would be acceptable, particularly on the British side, because one of the things the EU has said is, there are consequences to leaving. You can't expect to leave and have easy market access, easy immigration. You had those things. You've chosen to give them up. And so Norway has a pretty good deal, but you guys left. You can't expect to get a Norway deal. Maybe you'll get kind of an Australia level deal. You might not even get as good a deal as the US is getting, right? You left. You had all this. You had market access. Why would we go out of our way to make it easy for you who's decided to leave? Maybe that makes it easy for other countries to decide to leave, right? So this is all kind of, it's just unclear. I don't even have a good notion where that's going to land. I wish I did. The last piece I want to come to is Turkey. Every week we have to talk about Turkey, and Turkey is a full EU candidate country. They have a stabilization and association agreement. Technically, they have membership negotiations underway, although they're frozen. I haven't checked. I think of their 35 or so chapters, they've got 3 or 4 complete. Although there's some question whether those 3 or 4 are in fact still valid as being marked off as complete, given the changes in Turkey's structure. One of the things we've noticed is that a lot of things in the EU are weighted by the size of your country. And if Turkey joined today, they would instantly be the second most populous country in the EU. They would therefore have the second largest number of members of parliament. Their weighting for qualified majority voting would be equally heavy because of their population. And given their demographics, by mid-century, 2040 or so, maybe 2050 at the latest, Turkey would not instantly, at that point, become the most populous member of the EU. It's one thing to let in a small country. If you want to let in Serbia or Montenegro or Albania or Malta, that's not a big deal. But adding the second largest country by population, and it would be, I should have rechecked this, it would be in the low teens in terms of its GDP contribution. So adding a very large and number 2 in population, but number 18 or whatever the correct number is in terms of GDP is a significant challenge. A large rich country is one thing, a large relatively poor country. And all that's even before you get into is, under the Copenhagen criteria, is Turkey operating under the rule of law, civilian control of the military, a true market economy? They're probably a true market economy. Human rights, right? Turkey is a problem on all of these areas. How the heck can you let a Turkish candidacy move forward given the state of the relationship? We'll talk about Turkey a lot more next week when we talk about immigration. There are vast numbers of Turkish citizens living in the EU, several million, over 3 million in Germany alone. And Turkey is also in an agreement with the EU to stop migrants coming from Syria and the Middle East. And at the moment, the EU is paying them something like €1.5 billion a year to hold those people in Turkey. What if Turkey just decides to let them pass through like they were in 2015 and 2016? Anyway, my point is, how do you even begin to deal with the issue that Turkish membership represents and what it would mean to bring Turkey into the EU, extending the EU's border to Syria, right? These are really challenging issues without an obvious point of view.
Thank you for joining us for this European Union Governance and Policy Challenges lecture, co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union and produced by the Center for West European Studies and the EU Center, a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence in the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies.